Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent. Today we're going to pump the brakes on specific investigator discussions and paint with a broader brush. I want to talk about what makes Arkham fun for me, and I want to provide some additional clarity about what it means to have an investigator relative tier list as opposed to a campaign relative tier list. The reason I want to do this is in response to a type of comment I've seen a few times now on this channel, and in particular the recent video by Quick Learner in defense of Calvin Wright. Originally, I intended to more directly respond to his video and the points he made, but I threw out the script. The reason I tossed it was because all of his points fell into one of three categories. The most common category, when he's talking about Calvin's strengths, is that I agree with everything he's saying, no counterpoint required. Instead, I need to explain the underlying reason that we came to different conclusions. The second type of point he makes is one that egregiously misunderstands me. To be clear, I don't actually think this video is addressed directly to me. It's obviously referencing a lot of what I've said in recent videos, but I think it's targeted at people like me. That said, I'm still the target audience, and as the target audience of this video, I feel like several egregiously inaccurate assumptions have been made about how I enjoy and interact with Arkham. I'd like to set the record straight in that regard. Lastly, he makes several points that I would describe as conflating the ideas of being worth playing and being good. I don't exactly blame him for that, because I am absolutely certain that I've spoken carelessly and done the exact same thing in the opposite direction. Let's start with my username. It's rather incoherent, in part because it has the same ring as a zero punctuation, and I loved that channel when I took this username. The reason I took this particular username is because it is something that I aspire not to be. I often say to be clear and the like, because I do my very best to be articulate when my nature is to be snide and dismissive. I am a toxic spike. I do my best to be polite and non-confrontational at all times, but my inner monologue is extremely dismissive and arrogant. I'm sure that at some point I clearly stated what the investigator relative restructuring of my tier list meant. I'm sure that at some point I've talked about how strength isn't everything. I'm sure at some point in the past I've explained a lot of things that I'm about to now. But those moments of clarity are disparate droplets in an ocean of snide sarcasm and relentless optimization. So let me set the record straight. Let me explain, clearly and concisely, how I view the game. I want to start with the misunderstanding at the core of Quick Learner's video. I genuinely believe that he doesn't understand what is fun to me and that what is fun to him may never be fun to some other people. Towards the end of his video, in his conclusion, he says this.
If all you want to do is bludgeon the game in the exact same way, then sure, about 15 to 20% of the investigators are interesting or viable to you.
This is something I've seen in my comments sometimes, more often in comments elsewhere as people tend to be pretty polite. It's this notion that I am pigeonholed into a core set of powerful cards and that I only play the game one way. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the journey I've taken based on the destination that I've arrived at. You cannot analyze and improve, much less optimize, if you fully disengage from 80% of the game without ever touching it. The idea that min-maxers are doing this is dismissive and inaccurate. It fundamentally misunderstands what the optimization process is. Every investigator was interesting to me, every single one of them. After I play them, they get less interesting. I want to understand Arkham, I want to see how all the pieces fit together and achieve mastery over its systems. Once I feel I understand an investigator, they become comparatively less interesting than the other less played investigators. It's only interesting for me to replay an investigator with either a change to the card pool or by having somebody open my eyes to new and powerful alternatives to the way that I first played the investigator. The reason I'm always going to put at a crossroads in my survivor deck is that I cannot ever say, I saw the best that Parallel Pete could do, after running a deck that actively self-sabotaged by cutting some of the best draw cards in the game. I almost always play what I perceive to be an investigator's optimal deck because playing Arkham takes time, a lot of it. If I want to understand the most that an investigator can do, then playing an unrefined version of their deck that has cut some of its most powerful cards is, to me, a waste of time. 8 hours spent getting a relatively poor interpretation of what a character can do. I understand if that sounds weird to you. I mean, it probably is. Most people do not keep a tier list for their own personal frame of reference and enjoyment. I do not approach the game like most people. I'll get into it later, but I genuinely believe that this comment is not aimed directly at me. That the target audience is people who think like me and people who are misinformed by my videos and shutting themselves off to the exploration process of the game. But I do want to take a moment and address the idea of saying that directly to me because there are people who seem to believe this about me. If you believe I make boring, efficient decks that are pigeonholed into being boring and efficient, that's completely fine. That's honestly a pretty fair assessment a lot of the time. But if you genuinely believe that I'm amongst the people that haven't branched out and never leave their comfort zones, You are either not listening to me and instead imagining in your head what my opinions and experiences are, or you are intentionally strawmanning me. I have been claiming that Flexmark is better than Fightermark for a year. I am on the verge of putting Parallel Pete in my S tier. If you think I am averse to janky and unusual gameplay patterns, you're horribly mistaken. I'm just averse to being obtusely shit. Coming back to the idea that only a small percentage of the investigators would be appealing to me, we're actually begging the question. Begging the question is a logical fallacy. It means assuming a premise without having proven it. Specifically, it assumes that what I want to do is beat the game as efficiently as possible. That's close, but it's also completely wrong. I want to play the investigator as efficiently as possible. That absolutely contributes towards beating the game, but beating the game is not the reason I am optimizing. I am optimizing to better understand what every investigator can do and to better understand what beats the game most effectively. It's self-evident that most optimizers are doing this when you see them playing different characters instead of just steamrolling with only the same small roster of top-tier characters. To be as clear as possible, I want to understand what the strongest things you can do in Arkham Horror are. Achieving that sort of understanding requires me to play all the investigators and try all the cards. The reason you see me recommend Runic Axe in every fighter that can run it with 10 pips isn't because I haven't used the other cards. It's not that the other cards were never interesting to me. I've run them, but the problem is that recommending a lightning gun deck in a world with Runic Axe is ridiculous. At least it's ridiculous to me, and that's something I really want to address. While watching Quick Learner's video, I had to ask myself how other people view my content. What is their takeaway? Because a Quick Learner had been left with such a deep misunderstanding of how I approach the game, what else do people often mistakenly take away from my videos? It's worth noting that my videos have no stated goal. I'm just talking about the game and sending it live. And even if I did have a stated goal, it doesn't matter, death of the author and all that. What matters is what people take away. So what do they take away? In that regard, the recent video for Calvin is by far my worst Arkham video. It's my toxic spike nature at its absolute worst, and it encourages the exact thing I should endeavor to never let happen. I enjoyed learning Arkham. There is no amount of gameplay footage and discussion that I could have consumed on YouTube that would replicate the fun and satisfaction of playing to the game and coming to the conclusions that I have through experience. The worst thing my videos could possibly do is encourage somebody to skip that journey themselves. Just take my word for it and never engage with a portion of the game. That's what Quick Learner is addressing in his video, not me. While it feels targeted at me, I very genuinely believe that it's targeted at people who are pigeonholing themselves based on blind trust and crippling their own understanding of the game. Like I said a second ago, my Arkham content's not really for anything. I want to talk about the game. It's a platform for me to yell about something that I like. It has no further purpose. There weren't other content creators who approached the game the way that I did, and there weren't enough analysis videos for me to binge, so I started making my own and gave a voice to all the spikes out there. If my Arkham videos are for anything, it's to be an open discussion about how to wring the most power out of every investigator. It's not meant to tell you how to play, but rather to explain how and why I play the way that I do. It's to share my opinions about the card pools and play patterns. If I'm half the optimizer I think I am, there's merit to listening to me, but please don't take my word over creating your own experience. That's why I disliked my Calvin video in retrospect. I've never had reason to introspect on this, or to think about how other people interpret my content. With that Calvin video, more so than any other content I've ever made, the only logical takeaway is, I'm an authority on the game and I know that Calvin is trash and you shouldn't play him. To be clear, I still feel exactly that way, but with one major difference. It's not that you shouldn't play him, it's that I have no further interest or need to play him without massive changes to the card pool. The major issue was that it's so easy for me, especially when I'm having a good time and cracking jokes and dumping on a bad character and just really not taking the video very seriously, to conflate I have no reason to play this character with you have no reason to play this character. Especially when I so often make the mistake of thinking that my audience is predominantly veterans looking to talk about the game and not considering how newer players looking to learn might interpret my words. Coming back to Quick Learner's video, I think it would have been much more accurately titled, Calvin is bad, and that's okay. I'll be stealing that title, by the way. As I said earlier, almost all his points in defense of Calvin are things that I already knew and agreed with. I personally felt condescended to with the way he phrased a lot of his suggestions, basically just asserting that people who thought Calvin were bad hadn't looked at survivor cards while specifically showing off cards that I think quite highly of, But again, I genuinely think I'm just salty and this video isn't targeted at me. It's targeted at the people who have been listening to me without experiencing the things I have, without seeing the cards he's talking about. I will acknowledge that Calvin got at least 3 spots on my tier list because I just forgot about his ability to pass scenario tests like Locked Door. I'm so used to seeing Calvin do it that I don't even think about it like the shade of paint in my bedroom. But forgetting it and ignoring a part of Calvin's power, what little he has, is really unfair to the guy. So he'll be shimmying his way a little further up the tier list than he was. But as I was saying earlier, I'm aware of and agree with almost every point he made about Calvin's overall power level. The difference is in our conclusions, and it's because he is conflating being worth playing and or being able to beat campaigns with being good. I want to start by establishing that, in spite of this video, Quick Learner does not think Calvin is one of the stronger investigators. It's obvious in his conclusion, and I mean, just listen to this.
Is it good enough? It's good enough to win campaigns for sure.
Does that sound like the tone of a man that thinks Calvin is comparatively good when judged against other investigators? Calvin could be the poster child for why I reworked my tier list to judge investigators against one another rather than against the campaign. If you use whether or not a character can beat Innsmouth as your barometer for whether or not a character is good, then every character is good. The question is a foregone conclusion. You're going to find that everybody is great, and that discussions about what is good and what is bad tend to be incredibly distorted because everything is capable of winning campaigns, most of it reliably. I used to use the phrase, "they carry their weight," to describe investigators that met the challenges posed to them by the campaign and didn't actively weigh their team down by increasing the player scaling more than they contributed. The issue is that opportunity cost exists. Lightning Gun would be the best experienced weapon in the game if it was the only one. You can spend experience elsewhere. You could have brought somebody else instead of Calvin. We live in a world where every investigator can carry their weight and meet the challenges of the campaign. Does that mean everybody is equally good and that optimization is largely pointless? I genuinely think some people feel that way, but I don't. If I felt that way, I would stop playing Arkham. I enjoy optimizing. If it had no reward and no meaning, I would not play this game. Let's talk about my tier list a little bit. In the past, it has been campaign relative. There was no F tier, as nobody failed to beat campaigns. D tier indicated a really problematic character, and C tier characters would still be halfway on board the struggle bus. In those videos, I said there was a real argument D tier shouldn't exist, that no character struggled that badly to beat campaigns. Today, in the post-Hemlock Vale card pool, I don't believe D tier should exist on a campaign relative tier list. In fact, I think there are maybe a maximum of 3 characters that should even be in C tier. Almost the entire roster of characters deserve to be in B tier or higher if we are judging them against standard difficulty campaigns. I find that intensely boring. I want to talk about what separates the power between the best and the worst, and crushing down the tier list into just 3 tiers, 4 if we add A+ to allow for greater stratification, sucks. I would have much rather rank the investigators against each other. I mean, they literally are against each other. I have to pick one at the cost of bringing somebody else. When my team asks for a fighter and I choose to bring Silas, I do it at the cost of a Roland or a Dexter or a Fenn. So with regards to restructuring the tier list to be investigator relative, first of all, I just like having my tier list not be so incredibly top heavy and weird. Second, investigators are competing with each other for a spot on the team, and it feels more honest to rank them against each other than against the campaign that they all beat, or at least more worthwhile. Third, I have always viewed investigators in a comparative light in the first place. I think most people have. Compare and contrast is a basic analytical tool that I use all the time, and most people do it too. They can't turn it off if they want to. It's natural to compare things. I'd love to just move briskly on from that, but it's actually a contentious statement that I need to harp on about. A lot of people like to act like you cannot compare investigators because they are too different. It's apples and oranges, after all. I agree, it is apples and oranges, but the damn things have nutritional facts, and an apple will not prevent scurvy. You can compare different things. If they were identical, we wouldn't need to compare them in the first place. Nuance does not shield you from comparison, it merely makes it harder. Saying that a character is a flex that does X, Y, and Z and wants to be on a team that has this and that, and building up such a high level of nuance that no comparison is valid, is cope. I'm a toxic spike, I'll remind you, but it's fucking cope. It is mental gymnastics in an effort to defend something you like, something I fully admit is capable of succeeding in this game, from being compared to its better alternatives. Investigators can be compared. If you disagree with this statement, then you disagree with the entire notion of a tier list. I'm not saying that's an invalid opinion to have, but I'm of the opinion that having a tier list is a great framework for discussion. Rather than convincing myself that things cannot be compared to the benefit of absolutely nothing, I would much rather enjoy a conversation about the comparison. I believe that investigators can be compared. I believe there is a joy to be had in that comparison and knowledge to be gained from it. I think a tier list is better served comparing investigators to one another than it is at judging how well these investigators beat a campaign. My tier list is investigator relative now, and no longer campaign relative. When I eventually post a full tier list video, the 5-minute wall of disclaimers and context that comes at the start will include me stating that every investigator is viable and beats campaigns. My investigator videos don't all include that same disclaimer, because I'd have to say it a lot. It'd be like 1 to 2 minutes in every single video. It was, or at least should have been, a disclaimer said somewhere near the start of this series. I genuinely don't know. I will not be going back to check. Pretty sure I said it. Doesn't really matter now. That was a lot of words to get into what good means when I say it. Good isn't relative to the campaign. If it was, then everybody's good and nobody's bad. Miss me with that toxic positivity. The huge issue that caused Quick Learner's video, and now this one, is that while I erroneously used being good to mean being worth playing to others, he's doing the exact opposite. Calvin isn't good. He can beat campaigns, but so can everyone else. Again, listen to this.
Is it good enough? It's good enough to win campaigns for sure.
I mean, honestly, his tone of voice when he rhetorically asks himself if Calvin is good says more than I ever could. If this is the defense of Calvin, then Dumpster Fire doesn't do him justice. The dumpster was filled with thermite and it's burned 2 levels deep into the sewers. Quick Learner believes that Calvin is worth playing to others. He's right, by the way, I'm the fuck up here. But in his video, he conflates being worth playing with meaning that Calvin is good, the exact opposite of what I've done. It's understandable. He likes Calvin, he has succeeded with Calvin, and Calvin is sufficient to do what the game asks of you. The issue is that good is a relative term. When I say that Calvin is bad, I'm not comparing him to Innsmouth. I'm comparing him to Rex. I intentionally picked Rex here, as it's a comparison people have complained about before. Quick Learner pokes fun at it. The reason I often pick Rex when I'm making comparison is because the quickest way to show how weak something is to compare it to something that is very strong. But Rex isn't just strong, he's incredibly simple. It's easier to compare the net effect of jank with the raw power of something simple than it is to compare it to a different form of jank. It better highlights how weak something is when compared to something very strong. When people say it's not fair to compare the worst investigators to the best, it's wholly missing the point that yes, this does make a Kluver Calvin look awful, but a Kluver Carolyn looks a lot less awful in that comparison than Calvin does. It would be much, much harder to compare a janky investigator to another janky investigator, thus the simpler comparison to something at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's not because I think Rex is the closest investigator to Calvin. That would logically be a character that's very close to Calvin on the tier list, and then we just ask where we put both of them and it doesn't help us place anything. The point is that it's a simple comparison with something that is concretely somewhere in the tier list to show how far beneath or above it we are. You can call it unfair, you can say it's overly simplistic, and you can say it's dismissive. Any comparison can be all of those things, but none of them make it an invalid comparison. With the exception of this video, I have not scripted a video in years. I can fully believe I made bad off-the-cuff comparisons that were overly simplistic and dismissive because I was fed up with trying to explain how weak something was. Being unfair and dismissive doesn't make it wrong, although I do apologize for what is most undoubtedly poor analysis on my part. I'm just taking it for granted that this is true because honestly I cannot be fucked going back to check. Sidetracked again, huh? Like I was saying, the conflation of good and worth playing. Calvin is only good when you compare him to something other than another investigator, but that's, at least in my opinion, intellectually dishonest because other investigators are literally the only thing that he is actually competing with. I don't even think that's a particularly hot take. Even though Quick Learner made a 20-minute video defending Calvin, his conclusion is basically that Calvin isn't comparatively strong and that the card pool is holding him back. Calvin being worth playing and Calvin being good aren't the same thing. But he's using the two terms interchangeably the same way I was, and it's causing him to do mental gymnastics to make the case that Calvin is good, when his real argument is that Calvin's strength shouldn't matter to whether or not you play him. That's not even me paraphrasing him. Here's the direct quote from his response to me in the comments. Strength of a character is not always, or often, the reason for choosing who to play. His video is telling people not to look at my content and close themselves off to Arkham. I agree with that, and I'm glad he's made me realize that I can be giving that impression. But his video is not a remotely compelling defense of Calvin's power level. I need to do better with regards to being clear and not guiding new players down less enjoyable avenues of playing the game. We both need to stop conflating power level and worthiness of playing for others. I've largely held back from being too salty about it in the video, but quick learner, man, you could do with being less condescending in your explanations of things. If your arguments for why people should reevaluate a character are tantamount to assuming that somebody only plays fighter cleaver duos and doesn't know what survivor cards do, then you are not arguing from a place of good faith. That shit was condescending as hell. This is a complete tangent. There was nowhere else in this video where it naturally fit, so I do want to shoehorn this in right at the end. Being at the bottom of my tier list, no matter what it's called, is always going to be controversial. It doesn't matter what it's named or who I put there. There are no 5 investigators I can name to put at the bottom of Tier Z Doo-Doo Land that wouldn't have defenders coming out of the woodwork to tell me that I'm wrong and Poo Poo McPeepants is actually a pretty decent investigator. Every investigator works. Every investigator wins campaigns, almost all of them reliably. Someone has had a wonderful experience with every one of them. There is no bottom 5 I can name that will not ruffle feathers. Anyways, that's going to be all. Genuinely, I would like to thank Quick Learner for opening my eyes to some mistakes I've been making with how I phrase my own arguments. I don't care too much about needing to improve my own analysis. I always feel that way about my own content all the time, but opening my eyes to how what I'm saying can negatively impact new players is actually something I care about quite a lot. Since my friend Andrew doesn't have a YouTube channel, I'd also like to pass on his thanks to Quick Learner for getting Calvin a few more spaces away from tier list bedrock. I hope this doesn't come across as pointless YouTube drama bullshit, and that it does genuinely help to explain how I approach the game. A lot of Quick Learner's arguments are rooted in enjoyment of the game, but fundamentally misunderstand that the process of optimization is how I enjoy the game, and that my refined, boring decks are not a result of me never branching out, but all of my branching past figuring out that these are the most efficient things I can do. Thank you for your time, and if you made it this far, well, you know the drill. Before I go though, a massive thank you to my patrons over on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube. See you in the next one.